Welcome, Wargamers, to our last look at the Prime Dominion as we conclude coverage of the Animosity 3 narrative event and what an ending it is going to be. This will be a longer episode, so buckle up and settle in because today we're exploring all the ways the 6 satrapies of the Prime Dominion are fighting back and together against the vampire MITHRIDATES ALTI. Now, as I said, this is the final video in the storytelling and the unfolding narrative, and if you want the full picture of this, head back and watch everything in the series leading up to it, because we just gotta jump right in. There's so much to cover. Now, the flow of this week is going to be a little bit different, because we have a few narratives that are happening all simultaneously. One is the huge assault of the combined power of all the satraps against Castle Iskar itself, an epic siege event meant to cripple the necromancer's power, but along with it are smaller battles featuring specific satraps, either working together or not, to achieve something that will help impact the larger battle. Think of them as like secondary objectives kind of a thing. And to keep you kind of in the minute of how things are going as they unfold, we're going to be alternating back and forth from that main siege to these side stories, and coming together at the end with a final conclusion. MITHRIDATES ALTI delivered an ultimatum to the denizens of the Prime Dominion, revealing his plan to use the Black Sun Noctis, which was revealed to shroud the Dominion from the sight of the gods. The idea being here is that this vampire wanted to completely seal off the Prime Dominion from the rest of the mortal realms so that he could be the god of this little land. In the face of Alti's aggression, after he razed this huge castle and caused all kinds of destruction and then demanded servitude from everybody around him, all the satrapies had started to band together to save the city of Iskarion, and now the mercenaries of the satrapies have rallied against him as well. This is now a fight for survival, because if he's allowed to do his plan and seal off the Prime Dominion from the rest of the realms, all the mercenaries, which is the player characters of you and I, we can't leave. We're trapped. And so that's why, you know, all these things that we've been fighting against each other for the last 4 weeks, we all get on the same page, because it's like none of this works if no one can leave. But there is a little bit of context here to really grasp kind of the importance of Alti's plan. One is that individual players were offered the chance to side with Alti this turn. Turn meaning the entire week that they were like collecting narratives and that kind of thing. And they would receive vampirism as a reward for that. The point being, nobody knows who to trust. It was the same problem that led to the Civil War in the first place, is that when you have agents that are becoming soulblight vampires without anyone knowing about it, everyone is a suspect. So just kind of keep in mind that the entire saga that we're going to cover the rest of this video is all with the eye of suspicion about not knowing what your ally or potential enemy's motivations are. Secondly, for Alti's plan to work, he really just needs 2 items. One is a key that he has, and this was what allowed him to raise his castle, and he's now kind of using it in the ritual to control the orbit of Noctis. The other item was one that we've actually mentioned a few times here, and that is an item called the Eye of Noctis, an artifact that the Dornyar and the Aranar were battling over for, I think, 3 weeks. When you have both items together, it would allow basically Alti to do whatever he wanted. Because he does not at the moment have the Eye of Noctis in his possession, his spell is just a little bit tougher to do. It's requiring more of his focus, and it's just requiring more of him. And with that revelation of him needing the Eye of Noctis, it is also revealed that the Dornyar had been secretly allied to this vampire for some time, and he was hoping that my satrap, again, Dornyar here, would have succeeded in getting the Eye of Noctis for him. Alas, the Aranar got the eye instead. Now, to clarify, that doesn't mean all the mercenaries, like the individual armies, like my specific Chaos Force, isn't vampires, but the satrap that we joined or were hired by was. And this whole dump of information is really what we learn as the story opens up to kind of like the first steps of that siege happening, where we have tons of airships, either crude contraptions by the Skaven or Karajan Overlord, you know, flying vessels, ironclads all over the place. And as these ships are like this big armada is flying towards Castle Iskar, again, made up of ships from just about everybody, they're being attacked by cannons that are all along the ramparts. There are endless spells in the sky that are just mulching through ships. There's some wonderfully written destruction scenes. I'll leave the link down below to the full unfolding narrative. It's a huge read, honestly. It's like a free ebook if you want a little more time in the world of Age of Sigmar. One of the things I love is that covering fire was provided by Skaven engineers who mounted gnaw holes to Akshi on metalliths and used the resulting fiery thrust as propellant. So basically, we just tear open a wormhole to, like, I don't know, a volcano erupting, and it just fired whatever that hole was mounted to, in this case huge hunks of rock, and used them as huge bombardment pieces. And all these things went into basically turning stone and earth into a rain of meteors crashing into ALTI's castle. Now, a lot of ships were destroyed, but several of them did make landfall on Castle Iskar, and portals were opened by satrapy mercenaries to funnel troops directly from Iskarion. The forces of ALTI consisted of hordes of undead at his service, but also many of the Iskarneth turned to his cause. When he showed up and was like, I'm going to carve out my own empire, there were people who were like, well, we're not doing a great job on our own, so why not? There's also cultists and mercenaries, and together with the monsters that came from the Lux Umbra, he had quite a formidable army all said. The assault on that main gate for the Castle Iskar was managed by a joint force of Arinar and Idrelek, who broke through using demon summonings, showers of blood cauldrons, in a force built upon sheer numbers. So here we are at the main assault on the gate of Castle Iskar. I'm going to, again, like I said, put a pause in that story. We're going to put a pin in it, and we're going to talk about a side mission here. This one is simply known as the Blinding Eye, and it features the Arinar and the Teklandek working together versus ALTI. At this point, ALTI used his ritual with the key to start altering the orbit of Noctis, that moon that flies around the Prime Dominion, and place it directly above Castle Iskar, and the Prime Dominion blocking the Realm Gate. Now the Arinar, as I said before, have the Eye of Noctis, the item that he wanted, and their wizards came up with a plan to use it, seeking help from the Teklandek to secure the ritual against ALTI's agents. The idea being they would tap into the Eye's magic to counteract ALTI's ritual and return Noctis to normal. Again, there's two items for this ritual. ALTI has one, they have the other. They're like, oh yeah, we can just kind of use these to cancel each other out rather than having one side have both. The Teklandek, however, did not deign to send much help to the Arinar, and the ritual site was overwhelmed by agents of ALTI. There were a ton of players willing to risk their character's death in this turn so they could be featured, and so the GMs made good on their promise, the satrapy's best chance to stop ALTI's ritual dead in its tracks. However, unfortunately, because there just wasn't enough support, the plan to use the Eye of Noctis ended in utter failure. But that's just one avenue that some of the satrapies were trying to fight back. Back on the main fight for Castle Iskar, huge airships carrying mega gargants now landed upon the castle's firmament, and the gargants stomped in, crushing entire regiments to rubble. Skaven engineers and Stormcast wizards came up with a lightning-infused cannon that reduced the rest of the castle gate to rubble, and the defenses were well and truly breached. This is a side note for a couple of players who were just having fun. In the melee of all of this, King Tiberius, a player character who was a Lord of Khorne, even asked his superior, Alice Bloodwrath, who was a Khorne Black Pilgrim and lieutenant of Atressa Red Hand of the Idrelek, for her hand in marriage. She declined, but offered him a partnership with her in her Black Pilgrimage. That's just a fun little note, an Easter egg for anyone who's been reading the full details of all the different satrapies week to week. A little love story in the background. And hey, what better place to bond for Khorne warriors than in the middle of a battle? So at this point, you know, the gates of the castle are breached. We're gonna, again, put a small pin in it and go check out another side story, this one called the SEER Stone. And it features the Dornyar, now officially aligned with ALTI, tricking Idrelek into jointly destroying a relic which was interfering with ALTI's plan. So essentially what happened was the Dornyar came to the Idrelek We're like, hey, listen, there's this magical rock that is actually empowering ALTI's spell, and hey, if we destroy that, we can really hurt him. And kind of like, you know, throw off his plans and his machinations, and we'll shut this whole thing down. We can be heroes. But the truth is that whatever, you know, nexus of power that was actually hindering ALTI's plan, so that by destroying it, it makes his plan work better. Again, the Dorniar are secret agents aligned with ALTI himself. But remember, the player characters, you know, collectively known as mercenaries, are not the same thing as the Dorniar themselves. The mercenaries working for Dorniar, myself included, became disillusioned with ALTI's plan for the Dominion, and most decided to turn against Usildrad, the leader of the Dorniar, and join the forces of the Satraps against the vampire ALTI. The diplomats of Dorniar leaked the truth of the Dorniar siding with ALTI and the SEER stone plan to the Idrelec in the hope that they would trust them. They did, and together focused instead on protecting the SEER stone from the remaining Dorniar loyalists and watchers of Usildrad. And then we get a fun little story where, again, Ulistrad, the satrap of Dorniar, basically at this point his hand is shown, right? They figured out, hey, you're lying about this stone. Not only that, but you're working for ALTI. And so he just kind of like, you know, drops the shroud altogether and is essentially just full bad guy, using the power of his Throne of Light, which is basically a chair made out of pure realm stone that he sits in. It like magnifies his power, and he starts projecting himself across battlefields. And he's like fire and lightning everywhere, destroying all kinds of stuff. And really what this story kind of devolves into is the mercenaries, or anyone who isn't on ALTI's side from the Dorniar, plus the Idrelec as a whole, fighting against Usildrad. They use all kinds of artifacts that were picked up throughout the course of the campaign, and essentially they create a sense of magical backlash, which is something that we've seen before in Age of Sigmar lore, that kind of smashes back into Ulistrad and somewhat cripples him. So the point of this all being, you know, his trick to basically, you know, dupe the Idrelec into making the ritual a total success, ALTI's ritual, that is, for the Prime Dominion, totally backfired. Everyone saw through it and turned against him. Threat eliminated. Congrats, golf clap here, to all of the mercenaries who participated in dethroning a despot and tyrant like Ulistrad. Now, again, back to the main battle, the main siege going on up in the sky. A large force of Teklendek now burst through into the deep parts of the castle with tremendous casualties, right? More players being slain left and right. At this point, everyone is just all in on sacrificing themselves to get this story done. At this point, ALTI himself joins the battle with the mercenaries who sided with him, revealing themselves openly. ALTI still had to maintain concentration on his ritual, but still managed to slay dozens of champions of the Satraps who tried to come at him. At this point, a huge gnaw-hole opened in the courtyard, allowing a horde of Selendek warriors, led by Chuglord's train engine, with Renaya Oathsworn, satrap of Selendek, at its lead. The Selendek smashed open the inner courtyard, and Renaya fought directly with ALTI while supporting her troops with magic. Now that being said, Renaya couldn't possibly best this vampire, but her Ekshi-infused sword got stuck deep in the vampire's gut, and he was getting tired. Because at this point now, he's trying to balance this huge spell that's like moving a planetoid, and he's also trying to fight people here on the front porch of his castle. So ALTI retreats to keep drinking blood and try and heal, and the loyal mercenaries of Selendek, in particular, Lixbit the Grey Seer, took great pains to rescue Renaya and take her off the battlefield. Another champion, known as Ash of Volk, intercedes, tries to fight ALTI, unfortunately is not quite as successful as kind of started out trying to be, but it does put ALTI on his last leg, and his control over Noctis begins to slip if he doesn't get back to the key to stabilize it. He chose to flee and heal by drinking the blood of prisoners he had stashed ahead of time. The cost of recovering was to let the ritual loose, and the gravitational pull of Noctis returned, starting to destroy the castle spires. Basically, it's all coming apart for him. He's being pulled in too many directions to keep the castle safe and the moon in the sky and fight all these people in his doorstep. Now we have one last side story here that we're going to dive into, and this one features the Selendek and the Ruular as they attempt to destroy the Zephyr Quartz that holds the castle aloft in the sky, essentially trying to destroy what keeps the castle levitating so it'll plunge to the ground. And of course, if the castle drops out, everything in it and with it goes out as well. So these two forces, the Selendek and the Ruular, put together little strike teams and they infiltrate the castle's lower caverns. ALTI's ritual was failing, and the floating island now starts to fall apart. It's listing side to side, it's becoming very unstable. The Selendek and Ruular mercenaries fight to the Chamber of Crystals, with Marshal Zod-El of Selendek having brought the artifact, Selenar's Bite, which they had won by trial combat earlier this campaign, to shatter the crystals. A ritual goes down with a Skink Star Priest, and basically they destroy the crystals. I mean, honestly, at this point, the castle itself is just barely listing in the sky. The crystals are destroyed, Castle Esgar starts falling, and only some of the player mercenaries made it out in Ilyana's vessel. The rest were crushed. See, basically there's just more player characters dying. Everyone's sacrificing themselves to make this happen. Now, one more time, back to that main battle, the Satraps versus ALTI as a whole. The mercenaries of the Satraps now chased ALTI through the labyrinth of deep castle passages, fighting other mercenaries who had joined with the vampire. Atressa Redhand and Cardus Lightbringer, Satraps of Idrelek and Ruular respectively, led this advance personally. The mercenaries finally breached into ALTI's throne room, where he was trying to reassert control over the key. The mercenary Throm of the Arenar rode in on his Draconith Tassakarn and wielded the cursed blade that belonged to his slain fellow mercenary, Torag. After a losing fight, Throm sacrifices himself by unleashing the power of the blade, slaying the last of ALTI's defenders and knocking the vampire to the ground. Finally, after opening one last portal deep from within the castle, a couple Karajan frigates of the Teklendek flew straight into the castle's larger corridors and into the throne room. They carried Dariel the Resplendent, satrap of the Teklendek, and his last mercenary force. ALTI still had enough force to dispatch, some of the mercenaries, but he was finally disarmed, held down, and slain by Dariel. So that is it with this. The main threat to the Prime Dominion is done. Essentially, Noctis shifted back into its normal position, so kind of on a geographical level, things are back to normal. The castle has fallen apart. The items of destruction, all these artifacts, are then returned to their respective satrapies and basically sealed away, so this can't happen again. And so we're going to move into sort of the more resolution type things from a narrative perspective. So straight up, my boy Ulestrad, the leader of the Dornyar, who turned out to be a vampire or at least a conspirator with ALTI, he's laying dead in his artifact throne, basically when his own Seraphon lieutenant, Titar Muntek, bursts in with a Draconith Cadera and basically just peel his dead body off of it. The island of Iskar just kind of crumbled into dust. It had a slow drift and was eventually kind of caught in Noctis's orbit and was eventually broken apart in the sky. It kind of just got pulled, like hunks of rock got pulled into the realm gate, and it just kind of dissipated. Now, it was said that mercenaries witnessed his assistant, Vashti, who's a character that's come up time and time again throughout this entire campaign, escaping the destruction earlier and not being slain. Now, keep in mind, all of these Animosity campaigns are linked together, so she very well may come up again in the future. And Dariel the Resplendent, former satrap of Teklendek, was named Seraph of the Iskarneth due to the many victories they won and popular support that they accrued. The satrapies were dissolved, so there's not 6 factions in the Prime Dominion, there is one. Atressa of the Idrelek was named Duchess of the Outer Isles and Protector of Iskarion due to their crazy battlefront prowess in defending the Dominion. And Duke Caradris of the Ruular became Dariel's official advisor. The Arenar were considered conquered at this point because they were just crushed under the weight of all the things that were going on around them. But Iden the Auric of the Orinar was granted legal protections for his vaults and possessions, and none of them were taken as public property. So basically, they kind of dissolved the idea of these 6 factions, and the Orinar didn't really retain a lot of things, but they also weren't persecuted for any things that they did. The Selendek, being Dariel's sworn enemies, were not executed or imprisoned, but exiled as recognition for their aid in defeating ALTI. So they weren't executed, but they're like, you can't stay here. Like you picked too many fights and tried to do too much. They just ticked off the wrong guy. When the one person you annoyed in round 1 becomes champion, and I say person, it's not a person, it's Teklendek leader, right? He's not a player character. It's a bit hard to come back from that. So they were allowed to leave, so those characters can return again, absolutely, and should next year. And then lastly, Usuldrad of Dorniar was labeled the traitor, and all records of him were expunged. So friends, it's been a long couple weeks, y'all. This is a lot of story. I know I barely covered half of it. I really do recommend, if you want the full details, go read the unfolding narratives. I will put the link for all of them in the description down below. This has been a super fun, wild ride. Now, I know that some folks were a little bit anxious about maybe like they didn't feel like their faction got the time in the sun, but the truth is, collectively, from us around the world, we created a story of a civil war where someone tried to take advantage of the chaos, and then everybody had to put their personal garbage aside to fight against them, and in that story arc, one of those factions rose to prominence, and I have to say, Dariel of the Teklendek certainly did basically do quite a showing, because, man, they did some really cool things. The Teklendek, absolutely, they pushed back an invasion round 1. Turn 2, they did a huge heist of a giant artifact. Round 3, they went and picked a fight with the Selendek again. They were always a moving force and a wonderful team. So everybody, we all contributed, we all won, because we created the story together that I thoroughly enjoyed these last 5 weeks, and golf clap for the Teklendek. As far as my satrap Dorniar, I gotta say, I'm really proud of how many of my I guess countrymen turned against Usuldrad, but to be honest, I kind of dig the fact that he was like a double agent. I don't know, I thought that was a cool touch by the GMs, and I did not see it coming at all. So thank you to my team. I hope everyone had a wonderful time, and I look forward to seeing you again next year when Animosity 4 begins. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I hope to catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming.